Imagine being born into a world where your body, your voice, and even your thoughts were considered dangerous, not by law alone, but by God. In many ancient empires, religion wasn't just faith, it was a system of control, and women were its primary target. So here's the question that should unsettle you. What if some of the most sacred rules in history were never meant to protect women, but to silence them forever? Imagine being born into a world where your body, your voice, and even your thoughts were considered dangerous, not by law alone, but by God. In many ancient empires, religion wasn't just faith, it was a system of control, and women were its primary target. So here's the question that should unsettle you. What if some of the most sacred rules in history were never meant to protect women, but to silence them forever? Our story begins in ancient Mesopotamia, often called the cradle of civilization. This is where some of the earliest written laws in human history were created, and they were not subtle. Around 1750 BCE, King Hammurabi introduced a massive legal code claimed to be given directly by the gods. The Code of Hammurabi didn't just govern crime and trade, it governed women's lives. According to these laws, a woman was legally under the authority of her father or husband. Her loyalty was expected, but rarely rewarded. Her punishment was often harsher than a man's for the same act. If a married woman was accused of adultery, she could be drowned. The man involved, often forgiven. Religion justified this imbalance by declaring women responsible for moral decay. A woman's sexuality was seen as dangerous, something that needed constant supervision. Marriage wasn't about love, it was a sacred contract of ownership. Even suspicion could destroy a woman's life. Accusation alone was sometimes enough for divine punishment. And here's the most chilling part. These laws weren't enforced by soldiers alone. They were enforced by belief. People believed the gods demanded this order. They believed punishment was holy. They believed women's suffering preserved divine balance. And this model, religion as law, law as control, women as property, would spread far beyond Mesopotamia. It was only the beginning. At first glance, ancient Egypt looks different. Compared to other ancient empires, Egyptian women appeared unusually free. They could own property. They could inherit wealth. They could even initiate divorce. To modernize, this looks like progress. But freedom in Egypt came with conditions, and religion enforced every one of them. Egyptian society was built around Ma'at, the divine concept of cosmic order, balance, and harmony. Everything had a place, and every person had a role assigned by the gods. For women, that role was narrow. A woman's highest spiritual purpose was not leadership or wisdom, it was motherhood. Religious texts and temple teachings praised women as life-givers, but this praise came with control. A woman's body was sacred only when it served the state, the family, and the gods. Female sexuality was carefully monitored. Pregnancy was celebrated, but desire was feared. Women were largely excluded from high priesthood. Major religious rituals were led by men. Even powerful queens were often portrayed as extensions of male divine authority. And when religion decided a woman had stepped outside her role, the punishment was not always violent. Sometimes it was worse. Social erasure, loss of status, silence. In Egypt, women were not openly chained. They were bound by expectation, and expectation was sacred. In ancient Greece, religion did something even more powerful than law. It told stories, and those stories shaped how women were seen for centuries. Greek mythology repeatedly framed women as a problem. Pandora, created by the gods, was blamed for releasing suffering into the world, not because she was evil, but because she was curious. Curiosity became a female sin. Greek philosophers echoed these myths, arguing that women were emotionally unstable, spiritually weak, and morally unreliable. Religion reinforced this belief through daily life. Women were banned from participating in most religious debates. They were excluded from political gatherings blessed by the gods. Many temples barred women during menstruation, labeling their bodies as impure. Marriage was considered a religious duty. A woman's obedience to her husband was framed as obedience to divine order. Even goddesses reinforced male dominance. Hera, the goddess of marriage, was celebrated for endurance, not power. Athena was praised only because she rejected traditional femininity. Greek religion taught men to rule and taught women to endure. And the most dangerous lesson? That suffering was virtuous. Rome did not just adopt Greek ideas, it weaponized them. Roman religion was inseparable from the state. To disobey moral law was to disobey the gods and the empire. Roman women lived under patria potestas, the absolute authority of the male head of the household. This authority was seen as divinely approved. One of the clearest examples was the Vestal Virgins. These young girls were chosen to serve the goddess Vesta. They were required to remain virgins for 30 years. Their reward? Honor and privilege. Their punishment? Death. If a Vestal Virgin was suspected of sexual activity, she was buried alive because spilling her blood was considered sacrilegious. Roman religion claimed this cruelty protected the empire. Marriage laws were also enforced through divine morality. Women were expected to be modest, silent, and loyal. Men were allowed far more freedom. Adultery laws punished women severely, while men often escaped consequences. Religion framed women as guardians of public morality, but gave them no power. And when Rome punished women, it did so publicly, to remind society that female behavior was not personal, it was political, and it was sacred. By the time Rome ruled the known world, the message was clear. A woman's virtue was the empire's property, and religion made sure she never forgot it.
In ancient India, religion was not just a belief system, it was the framework of daily life. It determined who you were, what you could do, and even how your life would be remembered. Central to this system was dharma, the sacred duty each person had to uphold. And for women, dharma came with strict rules. Obey your father before marriage. Obey your husband after marriage. Obey your son if widowed. Disobedience wasn't just frowned upon, it was believed to carry spiritual consequences. A woman's failure to follow her dharma could bring shame on her family, misfortune on the village, and even spiritual suffering in the afterlife. Religious texts portrayed women as inherently weaker and morally vulnerable. Men were taught that women needed guidance, protection, and sometimes strict control. A woman's value was often tied to her obedience, purity, and ability to bear children. Even widows faced extreme restrictions. Sati, the ritual of self-immolation, was justified as a sacred duty. It wasn't enforced everywhere, but in the places it was, the religious justification made refusal almost unthinkable. And here's the cruel twist. This system worked because women often internalized the rules. They believed that obedience wasn't just expected, it was holy. Faith became chains, invisible but unbreakable. In Imperial China, religion blended with philosophy to create one of the most enduring systems of female control. Confucianism wasn't just a code of ethics, it was a spiritual framework. The teachings of Confucius were reinforced by religious rituals, ancestor worship, and state ceremonies. Women were expected to follow the 3 obediences. Obey your father as a daughter, obey your husband as a wife, obey your sons as a widow. These rules were not suggestions, they were sacred obligations. Breaking them wasn't just socially dangerous, it was spiritually dangerous. Even everyday life reinforced control. Foot binding, practiced for centuries, was justified not only as a symbol of beauty, but also as a sign of piety and obedience. A bound foot was a physical reminder that a woman's body was not her own. Religious rituals also excluded women. Temples, sacred texts, and festivals were often male-dominated. Men interpreted the divine, while women were left to follow. The underlying message was clear. A woman who questioned authority was not only rebellious, she was spiritually corrupt. And centuries of belief made these rules almost unbreakable. Across empires, one pattern emerges. Religion turned women's bodies into battlegrounds. Sexuality became a moral test. Virginity was prized as a religious virtue. Menstruation was branded as impurity. Even desire, a natural human feeling, was framed as dangerous. Women were blamed for temptation. Men were praised for indulgence. This system of shame was more powerful than chains or prisons, because shame stays with you, and fear of divine punishment stays longer. Religious rules told women, you are holy if obedient, you are sinful if curious, you are dangerous if independent. And over centuries, these ideas became so deeply ingrained that even women enforced them on each other. Religion didn't just tell women what to do, it taught society to police them and made obedience feel like piety. This psychological control was the most effective of all, because it didn't require soldiers, it didn't require laws. All it required was belief.
Despite centuries of control, not all women accepted their fate silently. Across empires, some dared to question, rebel, or defy the rules, even when the cost was unimaginable. In Mesopotamia, priestesses secretly taught young women knowledge forbidden by men. In Rome, some Vestal virgins resisted their sacred vows, knowing punishment could be death. In India, certain widows refused to perform sati, risking social exile to save their lives. In China, women from noble families challenged foot binding, secretly walking barefoot in rebellion. But resistance came at a price: imprisonment, public humiliation, violence, death, and history often erased their names. Stories of courage existed, but they were buried beneath centuries of male-written chronicles. Still, their defiance planted seeds of change. They proved that even under the heaviest chains, faith, society, and fear, human spirit could resist. Suspense lingers. Even in worlds where gods were said to control fate, women found ways to fight back, quietly, strategically, and bravely. If you wonder why these systems lasted thousands of years, the answer is chillingly simple: fear and belief. Religion wasn't just a personal choice, it was a social contract enforced by entire communities. Belief in divine punishment kept women obedient. Male-dominated religious institutions reinforced authority. Social pressure ensured that even minor transgressions were reported and punished. Education, storytelling, and ritual passed these rules to each generation. Control became invisible. Chains weren't needed. Temples, rituals, and texts did the work instead. And when women internalized these rules, they became their own jailers. Obedience was no longer just law, it was morality, piety, and survival. The terrifying reality: a system doesn't need force to endure, it only needs belief and the fear of punishment that comes from the divine. Even today, echoes of these ancient systems remain. In some societies, laws and customs still dictate how women should behave, dress, and speak. Even subtle forms of judgment or social expectation carry the same weight as divine rules once did. Understanding history is crucial, because once we see how religion was used to control women, we can recognize when power hides behind piety. The lesson is haunting. Faith can inspire, comfort, and guide, but it can also be twisted into control. And when it is, those most vulnerable are often the ones who bear the heaviest burden. So the question remains: if belief can control generations, who should decide what is divine and who gets to enforce it? History doesn't just tell us what happened, it warns us what could happen again if we let fear and faith become tools of power.